Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, January the 27th. Keir Starmer today becomes the first Prime Minister since Theresa May in 2018 to head to China with a huge business delegation. Can he navigate this trip without triggering Donald Trump? My name is Anne McElroy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Keir Starmer's MPs, meanwhile, will be left behind. Now, they're openly talking of defeat in the Gorton and Denton by-election, which has been scheduled for February the 26th. At last night's meeting of the Parliamentary Party for Labour, we've been briefed that Attorney General Lord Hermer was making the case to the troops that Keir Starmer is, in fact, an international leader who is protecting Britain's interests by helping deliver geopolitical stability, which has an impact for jobs, prices and cost of living in the UK.
But in holding that by-election in such a hurry, which is something that you predicted yesterday, Sam, the Prime Minister has now created two flashpoints where there was one previously. He could have chosen to wrap it into the May elections, and without Andy Burnham, well, the loss of that seat might have been a bit more drowned out in the noise. Now MPs saying there is a moment of great jeopardy for the Prime Minister in late February if the by-election does fall to the Greens or Reform, both of whom are launching their campaigns there today. Will they miss the presence of Andy Burnham?
Well, I'll be finding out. I'm going to head on a train to rainy Manchester straight after recording this podcast, and we'll have more on that tomorrow morning. Labour still seems to be searching for a good candidate after the one subsequent name on MP's lips, the leader of Manchester City Council, Bev Craig, announced on social media she wouldn't be seeking the candidacy for the East Manchester seat. Andy Burnham himself appeared to suggest he accepted that the party won't be winning, with a reply on social media saying, "I'm not sure losing a by-election does us any good."
I suppose if it does get one, that would put Andy back in his cage a bit. But let's see. Anyway, to run through some of the other things coming on a busy day, Cabinet this morning, the first since that big row with the man from Manchester. It's not political cabinet. Lucy Powell, who voted for Burnham's return, will therefore not be there as deputy leader, but Ed Miliband, who called for Burnham to be able to stand, and Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting, who didn't express a view in advance, they will all be there. The tone is likely to be altogether somber, however, as the Prime Minister will welcome a survivor of the Holocaust to Number 10 to address the Cabinet as part of Holocaust Memorial Day.
Right, other things that are coming today. The ground rent announcement is here. I did actually jump the gun by a few hours yesterday, but I was only out by about 12 hours or so. But my goodness, Number 10 sounded grumpy that I got ahead of them yesterday. A couple of very terse messages. So there's been an announcement to the markets at 7 a.m, but the government wants to make quite a big fanfare of this announcement today. Maybe that's why they weren't too pleased with me jumping the gun yesterday. There's a prime ministerial TikTok, no less. Steve Reed is doing the morning round. I think he wants quite a lot of the credit for this PLP pleasing announcement. And generally, I think there's a sense that they want to get people, particularly renters, aware of what the government's doing. It's been a long, hard slog to get this over the line. Do you want to just spell out the things that are in it?
Sure. Well, here are the details of what it means. Ground rent is currently an average of £305. This change in the leasehold legislation out today means there'll be a £250 cap coming into force in 2028. After 40 years, this will reduce to a peppercorn payment. New leasehold flats will be banned. Ministers will argue that there are 5 million leaseholders, 900,000 will benefit in this parliament, and they're overhauling a dysfunctional and unfair system from the dark ages. Will everyone see it that way, Sam?
It's a good question, and that's a question that I've been raising. Look, the 2-year delay before implementation is interesting, and I do wonder if it will definitely survive the legislative process, because we've got the announcement, but that isn't the end of the matter. Because in the end, as we were saying yesterday, the government is choosing to call the bluff of investors and professional landlords and pension funds, all of whom have raised the alarm, saying that changing rules retrospectively on how much income that they can make from rents is kind of a dangerous thing to do, because it just simply cuts the value of investments that they've made, with lots of knock-on effects. So whether it's harming efforts to bolster the safety of buildings post-Grenfell, which have got to be paid for, and the money that they have to for that pot is squeezed, or whether it's the returns for pension funds and other investments, and Britain's reputation as a safe place to invest. Those are all the kinds of things that that side of the argument have been raising as possible harm, facing possible harm. But I can't referee this, and there is a big question in my mind. Has the industry and the wider financial sector been crying wolf? Or in this game of chicken that government's playing, are they about to be run over?
And we're surely going to find out. Obviously, Angela Rayner will take some credit for this. There's an interesting tale there in Playbook. Rayner was speaking at a fundraiser, and she made a rallying cry there for the government to do more Labour-y sort of things and to be more prouder of them. We've done a lot of really good things, she told a crowd of MPs and supporters. I think we need to be unapologetically Labour. We've got to make sure people have a reason to vote for us and they understand that we are on a path. So she talked about putting rocket boosters up this Labour proposition, and that she would make sure I make my voice heard in that process. So the not very quiet lady is turning up the volume. So, Sam, this week's voting, that's also one to watch, no? Sam, this week's voting intention figures. Drum roll.
This week, Reform up 1 on 25, Labour up 2 on 21, Tories down 1 on 17, Greens down 1 on 16, Lib Dems on 14. So sort of broadly unchanged. The Tories won't be delighted with just that small shift, but all within the margin of error. But I've got a second piece of polling, which I think is far more consequential.
So you just dropped the lead just to get us on the edge of our seats this early in the morning. Go on then.
I'd like to keep you on your toes. Look, this is massively sobering for every Labour MP who's talking about whether or not they should change leader. Right. We asked, do you think each of the following would do a better or a worse job as Prime Minister than Keir Starmer? Right. More members of the public in our poll thought Angela Rayner would do a worse job than a better job than Keir, with 37% saying worse, 12% saying better. More members of the public in this poll thought Wes Streeting would do a worse job than Keir Starmer, by 19% saying worse to 12% saying better. More members of this poll thought Shabana Mahmood would do a worse job than Keir Starmer, 22-8. The only candidate the general public thought would do a better job than Keir Starmer was Andy Burnham. 30% thought he'd do a better job, 12% thought he'd do a worse job. And the only point in having a leadership contest, the only point in changing leader is to make things better. But voters are just saying that Andy Burnham would make things worse. Everybody but Andy Burnham would make things worse. I actually think this is quite a big bonus point for the Prime Minister. It's interesting. You even dig down into current Labour voters, and current Labour voters think that both Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting would be worse than Keir Starmer. More of them think they'd be worse than Keir Starmer than think it would improve things. That should be a wake-up call to all of those planning their leadership contests. And it's a really interesting reflection on the Wes Streeting campaign, suggesting that he doesn't have widespread voter appeal, which surely would be the bedrock of any claim he would make to power should he choose to do so.
Really interesting, that, isn't it? Quite comforting for the Prime Minister as he heads off on his trip to China today. He can mull over those figures as soothing ones for him. Just a couple of very quick thoughts on that. Also, the markets, of course, were always happier and still look happier to keep Keir Starmer in the gilt markets. I think much keener to keep Keir Starmer there than have anyone else. I suppose if you are a challenger, if Angela, Wes and teams, if they were listening, might also want to sort of throw something at the wall and say, hang on a minute, we haven't had a chance really to lay out our stall yet. So the public is often change averse. At the same time, not very happy with Keir Starmer either, but change averse until they're able to see what a change would actually mean, which would basically mean you'd have to have a leadership contest. Oops, well, is that going to happen? Shall I turn to the great trip to China, Sam?
Yeah, this is one of Britain's biggest foreign policy moments of the year. I'm sad not to be there. It is very important. Do you want to just sketch out what's at stake?
Yes, Dan Bloom from our side, from Politico, is along for that jaunt. Allies of Starmer telling him in advance that the Prime Minister will keep pursuing his three-body problem of how to make the relationships with the US, the EU and China work for the UK, and not to trigger Donald Trump along the way, who is in slightly triggerable mood at the moment. So the Prime Minister saying then in another Bloomberg interview that he won't choose between countries. I just don't do that, he said, and he repeats that in a podcast. Even so, Starmer's search for economic growth can't entirely have it both ways, because we do have that balance between threat and opportunity, and particularly threat to national security. The Telegraph, inconveniently for Downing Street, splashing on reporting that suggests China hacked the mobile phones of senior Downing Street officials for several years. State-sponsored hackers, they claim, targeted the phones of some of the closest aides to former Tory PMs, to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, particularly the latter. And that reflects what security sources refer to as the multi-layered and textured relationship with Beijing, which in lay speak means it's a mixture of threat and opportunity. But keep your eye on the threat. I think ordinary phones will not be allowed anywhere near the Chinese on this trip. You've been along for one of these, Sam. I mean, what's it like?
I did the 2018 Theresa May trip to China. I also had a brief reminder of what these things are like when I did the India trip. And that was the one with Keir Starmer last autumn. On one level, these are fascinating moments, but incredibly frustrating to cover, because you're often just fed up a diet of slightly fantasy investment figures by the PM's team about the scale of deals being done and the sort of economic benefits of going. But if I could be extremely rude, those numbers are sort of about as close to fake news as you can get, because these are probably deals that would have been done anyway and were in train and are just sort of totted up into a meaningless kind of global figure. I'm not saying that having the Prime Minister backing business figures and taking them on a delegation isn't helpful. I'm just saying the very particular way of trying to sell these trips back home via the travelling pack is a complexity. Fun fact, there's no Rachel Reeves on this trip. We were expecting her to go alongside Peter Kyle, alongside the business delegation, but I think she's been substituted out. We're waiting to find out why on that. But I think just comparing the context for China over the last few years is actually, for me, fascinating. And how much you'll be able to do if you're actually sitting on the plane, it isn't quite clear.
I must say, I was quite surprised to see that about Rachel Reeves. There must be something else that she's going to be doing these days, because that was very much the expectation when we left Davos, that we were going to see Prime Minister and Chancellor out there together. So let's find out about that. What would you want to know then, Sam, if you were on that plane, making a pain of yourself, I'm sure? But
look, China is such an important country, and I would just want to understand how our approach to China is changing. So as I said, I went with Theresa May on that last trip to China in 2018. So I spent some time this morning comparing and contrasting, right? Back in 2018, the whole tone of that trip was very different to what Keir Starmer was embarking on. Back then, we were essentially ripping up George Osborne's golden era of very close relations with China. The big decision that we were all talking about was whether to strip out Huawei core components from our telecom system, which actually Theresa May decided to do the following year. And that's had an impact on how good our 5G is, interestingly. But that was the discussion, whether or not we cannot leave our national security to China-controlled, China-owned firms. So the entire crouch was one of suspicion. Yet, if you go back and read the sort of the notes, the official handout, the official readout of President Xi's meeting with Theresa May, the substance of our relationship was so much closer. Right back then, we were suggesting we were on track to do a trade deal with the Chinese. Obviously, that's not materialized. We were offering to cooperate with the Belt and Road Global Chinese Investment Program. Now, today, if you look at anything particularly to do with the Chagos Islands, which we'll talk about in a moment, they are, ministers make clear their suspicion of Belt and Road, but we were offering to help it back then. And also, you had President Xi promising to respect the one country, two systems agreement over Hong Kong, which bluntly has gone badly wrong with the clampdown on freedoms and the arrest of individuals in there. So, we had a harsher tone, but a more open relationship. Now we've got a more open tone, but the geopolitical context has changed. And you've got Trump hanging over it all. This trip, it seems to me, is being covered very closely by the New York Times. And is there jeopardy with Donald Trump is the question that they are asking. And it comes days after Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Canada if Mark Carney made a trade deal with China. Not that there's any indication that Canada and China are discussing a kind of economic agreement. So China, UK-China relations are in the context of how everyone else is dealing with them.
Absolutely. I think if I could just pause on this for a moment, Sam, I think where this fits with Keir Starmer's view of Britain in the broader shifting international kaleidoscope is fascinating. Now, on Canada, I think I maybe do disagree with you a bit, because I interviewed Anita Anand, the foreign minister in Canada at Davos, and she made very clear that the trade with China, whether or not it's a formal big, one of those big old bazooka trade deals, which don't seem to get signed these days. But I mean, the message from Mark Carney is in this big shifting world order that Canada wants to get away from reliance on the US. And she was really, really clear that it meant moving quite close to China, and that she thought that was clearly thought was something that Europeans ought to think about as well. That seemed to be the message. But goodness, the Chinese are busy hosting. It's one banquet after another, because no sooner than Starmer goes, then I'm sitting in Berlin today for a big economic summit. And I hear that the German Chancellor is following, I think, within about 2 weeks, already talking about pragmatic cooperation. Friedrich Merz is using that pragmatism word, that kind of language so important on trips to Beijing, to keep exports flowing, yes, but also to get over a really ill-fated visit that was postponed by the foreign secretary here, German foreign minister, last year. Macron has also been there trying to get China to support the end to the war in Ukraine. So all of these leaders have a reason to put China front and center of their policy. They do all seem to want slightly different things. Interesting. So the Chagos Islands, we've got that one. That's one of our specialities, as you mentioned. I just thought it was worth saying there that lease deal to give the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, the government is still defending that as the best way forward this week. But the ramifications of Donald Trump tilting at it really aggressively last week at Davos, which was a moment, that is still sinking in. Now, Nigel Farage has been claiming credit. He's been saying he highlighted the risks of this deal, and that effectively China was in the background there to President Trump. But, I'm hearing it a bit differently, that the thing that really triggered Trump was this idea of a lease. And there's a lease on Chagos. Where else is there a subject of a lease versus ownership? Your starter for 10, Greenland. And that seems to have really pushed Donald Trump over the line. Question, do we think Keir Starmer can soothe that? Can bring Donald Trump down from this pretty high volume of criticism when he talked about great stupidity that the UK had indulged over Chagos? Not something Keir wants to raise in Beijing, I think.
No, but the threat of China in the Chagos Islands is one of the things it would seem that the Americans are worried about. Right, let's leave it there. That's a huge amount. By the time we meet tomorrow, Keir Starmer will be in China for that historic trip. We'll keep an eye on that and everything else. So I will see you tomorrow. Good luck in Berlin.
Thanks very much. Viel Spaß. Have fun. Have a great day.